Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is that you are watching this, and what you're watching is What's Left. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next almost half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that I think are important enough to be worthy of your attention. So hopefully you'll stay with us for that time. If you have any questions, comments, reactions, whatever to the show, you can send them to me directly. This is my personal email here, whoviating@aol.com. If you didn't catch that, you can also go to my website. It's called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. The URL will be around here a couple times during the show. And you can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather do it that way. If you do send me email, please include something in the subject line to make it clear this is not spam. And be a little patient about getting an answer, because I'm really just not terribly quick about dealing with my email. So with that out of the way, let's get to it. I always like to start off the week with some good news, and I do have a bit of good news this week. On July 3rd, a state circuit judge in Florida ruled that the state's updated Stand Your Ground law is unconstitutional. Miami-Dade Circuit Judge Milton Hirsch found that the amended law exceeded legislative authority and actually was contravened by previous rulings set down by the state Supreme Court. Now, since it's sometimes a little bit unclear what these stand your ground laws actually are, as a brief and quite oversimplified explanation, traditionally, people who felt that their lives were in danger from some threat had a duty to retreat. That is, a duty to leave the situation, to back down from the confrontation before they could legally use lethal self-defense. In other words, in order to claim self-defense against a charge of killing someone, you had to show that you could not have defended yourself by simply leaving the situation. Exceptions were made for places like your own home. You had no duty to retreat from your own house. Now, stand your ground laws, at bottom, what they do is they remove the duty to retreat, and you can use lethal force if you feel you are at risk of death or great bodily harm. The Florida Stand Your Ground law, passed in 2005, specifically gave people the right to shoot first if they felt so threatened, and allowed judges to dismiss charges on the grounds of a reasonable claim of self-defense. The predictable result of this law is that in the years following, the average annual number of justifiable homicides in Florida tripled. And in fact, a study published last fall in JAMA Internal Medicine. Now, this is basically, Internal Medicine is a publication of JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which, as you may know, is the leading medical journal in the United States. But this study published last fall found a connection with this law and an overall increase in homicides in Florida, a 24% increase in the monthly rate of homicides and a 32% increase in the monthly rate of homicides involving guns in the state in the years following the law's passage. In 2015, the Florida Supreme Court stiffened the requirements of the law, saying that defendants had to prove in pretrial hearings that they were, in fact, defending themselves in order to avoid prosecution. So what did Florida do? The legislature, with the support of Governor Voldemort and at the urging of the Nutsoid Rabbit Brains of America, otherwise known as the NRA, they simply rewrote the law to put the burden on prosecutors to prove with clear and convincing evidence that the defendant was not acting in self-defense. It was that requirement that Judge Hirsch found an unconstitutional breach of the authority of the state Supreme Court. Now, this doesn't undo the law, obviously, and it's still possible that Judge Hirsch's decision will be overturned. But anything that puts limits, or at least the brakes, on the sort of pumped-up Wild West macho fantasizing driving these sorts of bills, anything that does that is good news. As a quick footnote to this, prosecutors in Florida were vehemently opposed to this updated bill because they believed it made it easier for defendants to get away with murder, which the record shows that is exactly what it does. Isn't it interesting how right-wingers are all about support the cops and support law enforcement and we're against crime and all the rest of this, until it involves something desired by the gun nuts, as this was, at which point the opinions of cops and prosecutors and so on just simply don't matter anymore. All right, next up, it is one of our regular features. This is the Outrage of the Week. Now, I had this as the Outrage of the Week just about 5 or 6 weeks ago, but I'm doing it again because it is a continuing outrage. We start by noting that for several years, the administration of the amazing Mr. O enforced immigration laws so aggressively that they actually deported more undocumented immigrants than any previous administration. Eventually, they apparently had a change of heart, or maybe they were just embarrassed by the increasing attention being paid to this stain on the liberal escutcheon of Obama. But for whatever reason, they took a different stand. In 2014, the Obama administration instructed immigration officials to use discretion in who they targeted for deportation. What they said is, for example, in moving for deportation, ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's the agency that enforces the immigration laws. ICE agents were told to consider factors such as the length of time a person had been here, their family or community ties, whether they had a young child or a seriously ill relative, that kind of thing. Well, the Rump Gang explicitly rescinded those guidelines almost as soon as they came into office and told immigration to enforce the law, quote, to the greatest extent practicable, unquote. Now, despite that guidance, however, agency officials still insist that ICE prioritizes the arrest and removal of national security and public safety threats. Or as the Rump put it at various times, they're going after the bad hombres. They are lying. A recent article in ProPublica details how ICE agents, under a directive from the head of its enforcement unit, are told to take action against any undocumented immigrant they encounter while on duty. Not that they may take action, which still allows for some degree of discretion, but that they will do so. David Beer, an immigration policy analyst at the Libertarian Cato Institution, said that the memo explains what we've been seeing on the ground, adding that the fact is that immigrants without criminal backgrounds are routinely being arrested and deported. People have been arrested for deportation on their way to their senior prom, on the way to the hospital to pick up their newborn son after emergency surgery. Even at an ICE office when they voluntarily came in for what was supposed to be a routine check-in, even at an ICE office when they voluntarily came in to discuss how they could obtain legal status. In fact, sometimes the arrests seem designed to be mocking the people arrested. A group of ICE officers had breakfast at a restaurant in Michigan, and then after breakfast, arrested 3 of the restaurant's workers. Andres Magana Ortiz was an undocumented immigrant who had lived in the U.S. for nearly 30 years. He has an American wife, 3 U.S.-born children. During his time here, he worked his way up from migrant coffee picker to owning his own land and being prominent in Hawaii's coffee industry, even to helping the U.S. Department of Agriculture conduct a 5-year study on an invasive insect species that was damaging the coffee plants and helping to run 15 other small farms. He lost his fight to not be deported, despite letters of support from Hawaii's entire congressional delegation and from the judge in his case, who, while legally unable to block his deportation, wrote a scathing opinion that, quoting, the government's decision shows that even the good hombres are not safe. On July 7th, Ortiz voluntarily left for Mexico just days before he was to be deported. Jesus Lara Lopez is an undocumented worker in a Pepperidge Farm food packaging plant. Like many undocumented workers, he has lived for years under the radar, working in the fields picking fruits and vegetables. He has no criminal record. He's supported his family. He's paid his taxes. He has never used any form of public assistance, not even unemployment. He's being deported on July 18th. Francisco Javier Gonzalez came to the U.S. alone when he was 15. He graduated high school and went to college, but couldn't graduate because he was unable to prove he was here legally. He now manages a successful restaurant in Palm Beach, Florida. He has an American wife, 3 U.S.-born children. He has no criminal record. Yes, he pays all his taxes. He was to be deported to Mexico on July 14th, but got an almost literal last-minute stay of 3 months. Now, Frank, what is the point in deporting people like these? What is the gain to us in doing that? What is the loss to us in letting them stay? What is accomplished by this beyond satisfying the desires of the white supremacist, bigoted xenophobes occupying the upper reaches of the Rump administration? And the case of Ortiz raises something else. Ignore for the moment that he is, by the way we were usually told such stories when we were growing up, he is almost literally a classical, almost cliche American success story, rising from migrant laborer to landowner, businessman, upstanding figure in the community. Forget all that. Just focus on the fact that he had been here for nearly 30 years, and it didn't matter. Because there's no essential statute of limitations on being an undocumented immigrant. No matter how long you have been here, no matter how many and thick are the roots you've set down, no matter how stable is the life you've established, no matter how much you've contributed to your community, none of it matters. I mean, think about that. There is essentially no statute of limitations. Except for murder, terrorism, and sexual crimes against children, federal law, and that is what we're talking about here. Remember, we're talking about federal law. Except for those cases, federal law has statutes of limitations for all sorts of serious crimes and all sorts of serious civil offenses, which, by the way, is what being here illegally is. It's a civil offense, not a criminal one. But the point is that we have federal statutes of limitations for all kinds of things, for kidnapping, for fraud, for racketeering, for embezzlement, for all kinds of things, but not for being an undocumented immigrant. 2 years, 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, it makes no difference. To me, this is insane. Even the notoriously anti-immigration, and note well, I did not say anti-undocumented immigration, I said anti-immigration. The notoriously anti-immigration Mark Krikorian, even he, a few years ago, allowed as how, well, even as he said he had disagreed with this as a matter of policy, but he figured the idea that an undocumented immigrant who has been in the U.S. for 3 years, that was what he said, 3 years, and had put down roots here, that maybe they shouldn't be deported, he said he disagreed with that, but he said, at least that makes a certain kind of sense. So even he thought it made sense. There could be some kind of time limit. There should be some sort of statute of limitations. There should be a point beyond which being able to show roots in your community and an established life will free you from the daily fear of discovery and deportation, from the daily fear of having your life ripped up and your family ripped apart. Now, we could talk about what that limit might be, and actually I have my own idea for what you might call an opening bid in that discussion, but I'm going to hold that aside for now to focus on the fact that there should be such a limit. But instead, what we have is a thoroughly bankrupt, thoroughly broken system enforced by the well-named Immigration and Customs Enforcement, because that's ICE or ICE. Well-named because it's cold-hearted to its core. A system now directed by an administration chock full of bigoted xenophobes who don't care who they deport as long as they can eject foreigners, eject them, eject the other, which they then have the unintentionally revealing gall to say is enhancing public safety. They're without mercy, they're without compassion, they're without understanding, they're without humanity, and they and the system they oversee are outrages. And we're going to take a break. And we are back. We are back to talk about something that I've talked about before, but which I haven't done in a while, but we have to talk about it now. It's net neutrality. Wednesday, July 12th, you may have seen some displays kind of like these on some websites you saw, because July 12th was a day of action to defend net neutrality. At least 234 websites representing corporations, activist groups, and just plain folks spent the day trying to alert anyone who came by to the serious risk that net neutrality may be killed off. Some of the nation's largest tech companies, such as Microsoft and Google, and some of the biggest online sites, such as Twitter, Snapchat, Netflix, Facebook, and Amazon, took part in this. Now, net neutrality, simply, is the idea that internet service providers treat everyone's data equally. A byte is a byte is a byte, and every byte is the same as every other byte. Whether it's from an email from your mother, an episode of House of Cards on Netflix, a bank transfer, maybe you're reading the day's news on your favorite newspaper's website, whatever it is. It means that outfits such as Comcast, AT&T, and Verizon don't get to say that this data gets sent more quickly than that data because the folks sending this data paid us extra money for that, so the folks who want to see that data are just going to have to wait and watch the spiral go round and round or whatever. By the way, net neutrality also means that the folks getting this data, they're going to get it. It's not going to be blocked because that website did not pay up enough money or something. Put another way, net neutrality is the principle that a handful of giant corporations riding on the back of technology actually developed by the federal government and a handful of universities can't manipulate the market. The market in this case being the companies and people who use the internet. They can't manipulate the market to line their pockets. And if the business about treating all data equally still isn't clear, think of it this way. It's how your telephone works. All telephone calls are treated the same. And for obvious reasons, outfits like Comcast, AT&T, and Verizon hate the idea and have been campaigning, lobbying, and suing against it for years. Despite some short-term legal victories, they failed. Due to a massive public outpouring of support for net neutrality, in February 2015, the FCC voted to reclassify broadband service providers as Title II common carriers, meaning in effect that they're regarded like a public utility, giving the FCC the ability to set rates, open up access to competitors, better regulate the industry, and most importantly here, to enshrine net neutrality as law as part of those regulations. Okay, so what's the problem here? In 2 words, the problem is Ajit Pai. He is the new chair of the FCC, whose only work experience outside of government was as general counsel for Verizon. And he is full out for repealing the 2015 regulations, leaving us at the mercy of the corporate overlords for who he used to work. He introduced a bill, a new rule in the FCC to do exactly that, a rule which is now in the period for public comments. It's a proposed rollback of the 2015 rules that was the target of the July 12th Day of Action. Because net neutrality, to be quite blunt, net neutrality is the spiritual heart, the philosophical core of the internet. It is the operating principle on which the net was founded when it was just a federal agency and a handful of universities, and on which it has grown, in fact, which has enabled it to grow. The fact that it was equally open and open on an equal basis to all participants, not just an elite handful of technocrats and technophiles. Now, yes, of course, it started that way. It started with a handful of technocrats and technophiles, but the principle of neutrality made sure it wasn't going to stay that way. And people understand this. In fact, net neutrality is overwhelmingly popular among Americans. According to a recent survey from Politico and Morning Consult, 60% of Americans support the current rules and only 17% want to change them. According to a poll done for Friedman Consulting, the figure is even higher. 77% support keeping existing net neutrality rules in place. And it's important to note that in both these polls, this was bipartisan. This was across the board. Democrats, Republicans, and independents registered support for net neutrality in similar numbers. You want more evidence of how popular it is and how important it is to people? That July 12th Day of Action generated 2.1 million comments to the FCC opposing the rule change. It's so popular, in fact, that Pai finds it necessary to claim that he supports the principle of net neutrality. He does that without actually being clear about what that means, without laying out any means to enforce it, except to propose to turn enforcement over to the Federal Trade Commission, which lacks the authority to write rules, and unless Congress proposes an entirely new law, which Pi knows as well as the rest of us ain't going to happen anytime soon, but unless that happens, the FTC could only enforce vague principles, and then only on a case-by-case basis after a complaint, that is, after the damage has been done. Pi is also notably frequently referred to the open internet as if it and net neutrality were the same thing. They are not. Back in 2015, at the time the FCC was acting on this, a former chair of the commission, Michael Powell, who was even more overtly pro-corporate than Pi is, also referred to open internet principles, which he defined as freedom to access content, to run applications, I'm quoting him here, to attach devices, and to obtain service plan information. Freedoms, which I noted at the time, did not include the freedom to access content on an equal basis, without being throttled or otherwise hindered because the site I was trying to access didn't have the big bucks to pay up that some other site did. Now we have another pro-corporate chair mouthing the same platitudes about an open internet. Extreme caution is called for. Especially because Pi has defended his desire to service the corporations with some pretty bizarre arguments which would cause people's jaws to drop were we not in the age of the rump. For example, he said, we cannot stick by regulations from the Great Depression that were meant to micromanage Ma Bell. Now, I'll just say that the notion that the Bell system was micromanaged will come as a shock to anyone old enough to remember the breakup of the Bell system in 1984, which was done because it was an illegal monopoly that was actively stifling any competition, or for that matter, anyone old enough to remember Lily Tomlin. He also claimed that strong net neutrality rules in the U.S. would give dictators an excuse to tighten their grip on the internet in their countries, which I frankly think should not even merit a response beyond something like, what? And he said the 2015 rules were established based on, quote, hypothetical harms and hysterical prophecies of doom. Now, that does require a response. And the fact is, we had already seen those harms. There was nothing hypothetical about them. In 2014, during negotiations over access, Comcast throttled Netflix, slowing transmission speeds by nearly 30% until Netflix agreed to come up with the cash for a so-called paid peering deal. Now, that deal and others like it were scuttled by the 2015 regulations, but it doesn't change the fact that these supposedly hypothetical harms, paying for access and being throttled when you don't, harms have already happened. We have, that is, already seen what will happen if net neutrality goes by the boards. It wouldn't happen all at once, of course. They know better than to spark a backlash even bigger than the backlash that the current proposal to undo net neutrality has sparked, which has gotten over 5 million comments, the overwhelming majority of them negative to the FCC. But it is clear what they are after and what they will do if they are not stopped. Now, the period for public comment on this rule, which again is to undo the 2015 regulations establishing net neutrality, the period for public comment on the rule runs through July 18th. So if there's still time, you might want to drop a note to the FCC. Oh, and if you're wondering why you haven't heard more about this before, part of the reason could be that NBC, CNBC, and MSNBC are all owned by Comcast. All right, we're going to wrap up this week with one of our occasional features. It's called For the Record, where we briefly cover several different items just because we want to make sure they don't slip by unnoted. So, For the Record, a quick follow-up to last week's Outrage of the Week about the war crimes being committed in Yemen. According to the Red Cross, the number of cholera cases in the country has now surpassed 300,000. For the record, according to a new poll by Pew Research, a majority of Goppers now maintain that colleges and universities are bad for America, that they, in the words of the poll question, are having a negative effect on the way things are going. 58% of the Goppers polled felt that way, an increase of 21 percentage points since 2015 as they adjust their brains to be in tune with the age of the rump. For the record, on July 7th, Governor Brian Sandoval of Nevada issued a statement of emergency. You see, recreational marijuana became legal in Nevada on July 1st, and retailers were already running out of stock to sell. Turns out the problem was a legal snafu because the places that are licensed to sell recreational marijuana don't have the authority to restock their inventory, and they depend on using alcohol wholesalers who are licensed to be distributors of marijuana, and no such licenses have been issued. The statement of emergency allows for a wider range of applicants for the distribution licenses than just those alcohol retailers. And a quick sidebar to this, one of the main objections to legalized marijuana is that the areas around retailers would be magnets for crime. But according to a new study out of the University of California at Irvine, when Los Angeles used new regulations to close 439 medical marijuana dispensaries in 2010, crime in those immediate areas rose 12%, while crime in the areas around those dispensaries allowed to remain open stayed the same. That echoed a finding from Denver, where the police department saw that through the first 9 months of 2010, crime was down 8.2% from the previous year after a dispensary was opened in the neighborhood. All right, for the record, and what I find a rather disturbing development, on July 11th, the European Court of Human Rights upheld a ban imposed in Belgium on wearing the full-face niqab veil in public. The court ruled that the restriction was necessary for social cohesion, the protection of rights and freedoms of others, and was necessary in a democratic society. Now, while I realize that the niqab has become for many a symbol of the oppression of women under Islam, I still admit to being very uncomfortable with the idea that we can define for others what they will find oppressive, and that such social cohesion is necessary, especially when you consider the harm that has been done and the oppression that has been justified by such terms in the past. Finally, for the record, ProPublica has an interview with a former member of the Wisconsin legislature who now regrets his support for the voter suppression goals of Scott Walk All Over You. Now, better late than never, I suppose, although regrets don't change the laws that were imposed, and a better way to express regret would be to actively campaign for the laws to be overturned. But I mention this here because voter ID and voter suppression have again become headlines because of the demands of the RUMP's so-called Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, the demand that they put out for all sorts of information about every registered voter in the United States. Now, I didn't address that this week because there's some other things as well that are also going on related to voter ID and voter suppression, and I want to address them all together, which I will do next week. So that's it for this week. So for the moment, we can look forward to that next week. Again, if you have any comments, questions, reactions, email me. You will get an answer. It may take a little while, but for the moment, we'll see you next week. You have the best week you possibly can. As always, peace.